What does it mean to be immersed? Director George C. Wolfe has said that more often than not, when you see a movie in the theater and it's having an impact on you, you move back into your seat. However, when a piece of theater has a profound impact on you, you lean forward. Why is that? I would put money to guess that it's because despite knowing that you're in a building steps away from the real world, the artists, the director, the actors, the costumes, whatever it is, that has gone further to break those binds of reality and almost beg you to say, I want to go to there. Think of a show where the set is as important as any character. Maybe it's the house in Beetlejuice or the sea in Life of Pi. Maybe the set is incredibly tied to the overall experience, like in the newest revival of Cabaret or Here Lies Love and Great Comet. These shows pride themselves on set design that is integral to the storytelling. This wasn't always the case. For many years, the scenic design of a show was meant to just act as the backdrop for a piece and not be in active conversation with it. Think back to your middle school play, where you wheel in the single backdrop of a painting and then you tell the audience, ah yes, the town square. How lovely. This was the case until Boris Aronson stepped up to the plate. Over a career spanning more than 50 years, Boris was a pioneer in using scenic design as a way of telling a story. He told theater artists that there was no idea too big or abstract. He gave sets so much character that to this day, we can't talk about many of the shows he worked on without mentioning his sets. When Arthur Miller tackled the US's fear of communism, when Hal Prince wanted to evolve the musical to tackle the dark and mature side of the world, when Stephen Sondheim elevated his music to dive into the human experience, when tradition needed to adapt, Boris Aronson was there. Without him, the theater doesn't ever need John Napier to make bridges for actors on roller skates for Starlight Express. They don't need him to make barricades for the revolutionaries in Les Mis or helicopters that fly in for Miss Saigon. David Zinn isn't challenged to create Bikini Bottom for SpongeBob or fit a recording studio on stage for Stereophonic. This is the story of one of the great world builders of the stage who mastered transportation. I'm Ricky from Pocket Dramaturg, and this is episode 2, Boris Aronson, your favorite set designer's favorite set designer. If there's one idea I want you to hold on to while you listen, it's that Boris Aronson always saw himself as an artist over a designer. Boris Aronson was born on October 15th, 1898 in Kiev, Ukraine. From an early age, Aronson was introduced to the world of theater when he became an apprentice to Alexandra Exter, a Russian painter who, among other things, was an influencer of the Art Deco architectural style, which, can be seen all over the world. But if you really need a visual, think the Chrysler Building or the Empire State Building. Exter was associated with the Cubo-Futurist and Constructivist style, which is an art form that reflects more abstract imagery as opposed to realism. Exter applied this in her paintings, but also in her side hustle as a costume designer. Because, artists always got to have a side hustle even back then. Through her connections in the theater, Exter was able to introduce Boris to directors Myers, Holt, and Tarov, who geared him towards using that constructivist style in his staging, which really emphasized using the stage as a blank canvas for the designer to work on, and would be a trend that would be significant in Boris's work for the stage. In the early 1920s, Boris's work as a painter would help him write 2 books on artist Marc Chagall. Remember this because it's going to be very important later. In 1923, Boris used the profits from his books to help obtain a visa to immigrate to the US, and he made his way to the Lower East Side to begin his career in the New York Jewish theater scene. So before we move forward, I have to say with full honesty here that there is very little I know about Yiddish theater. A lot of what I've learned has come from research for this episode. With that being said, I'll do my best to give us a little bit of background before Boris gets to the US. American Yiddish theater at the time served as a microcosm of the experience of many immigrants in the early 1900s. As Jews from Eastern Europe moved to the US and set up enclaves in cities like New York, The good old dream of the melting pot took effect and molded these people into Americans with a whole new set of values that would make them essentially unrecognizable compared to the people they were when they got to the US. In America, Yiddish theater moved away from its traditionally religious roots and became representative a little bit more of, popular drama of the day as well, and the world around it. This could mean anything from producing the works of Sholem Aleichem to experimenting with modern playwrights of the time like Ibsen. For this case, though, we're going to focus more on set design. Historically, set design in Yiddish theater wasn't short, simple, yet effective. Character was more important than flash. While the backdrops may be elaborate and painted with abstract lines and images, the sets showed restraint, something Boris would prove regularly to be exceptional at. Oftentimes, it would be the work of one specific signifier to inform the audience of where they were in a place or time. A single chair and a couple of farm tools to signify a barn, for example. The intent was always to communicate as much as possible, using as little as possible. However, as the Jewish artists evolved their craft after coming to the US, sets moved away from this minimalist approach and embraced realism in their sets, where the stage was meant to look as close to the real world as possible. This wasn't exclusive to Yiddish theater, but it certainly was something that had become more present as a trend. This is the world that Aronson would grow up in after moving to New York. In New York, he found himself working among the more experimental Yiddish theaters in the city, such as the Unser Theater, the Schildkraut Theater. In 1926, he had his first major success in designing The 10th Commandment, directed by Maurice Schwartz at the Yiddish Art Theater. I was actually able to find some information on The 10th Commandment, and when I tell you that Boris was already firing on all cylinders, I mean it. First off, the premise of the show centered around two angels as they tried to sway the actions of two Jewish families. One that's very religious and looking to stick to its traditional roots, and the other that's striving to be a more modern family. Hey, that's kind of like what I was talking about with the people. Oh my gosh. So already you can see that he's speaking to the kind of work he wants to be doing by taking on this job. Even back then, Boris's work stood out. A recurring theme we'll see with Boris is his ability to harness abstract concepts into a set design that resonates with an audience. In this case, the audience seeing the 10th Commandment was treated to Boris Aronson's interpretation of hell. And now, my friends, you will be treated as well. So first things first, he thought about the nature of hell, and how it's presented as incredibly personal in many interpretations. If one should find themselves there, it'll be reflected of the person they were in life. So overall, the frame of the set was going to be in the shape of a human head to represent the idea that only in our own mind do we know what hell is going to look like for us. Whew. All right. That's one thing there. Then Boris thought about the audience he was serving, and then he decided that within the head, he would depict hell as a factory. This was crazy for that time, because you have to remember that we're still very much in the era where immigrants from all over, including Jewish ones, were the people that were spending their days in the low lighting, hot, unsafe factories for very little pay. Not to mention the fact that the factory, in conjunction with, what we usually think of hell with, fire and brimstone, absolutely reminded audiences of the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire that had happened only 15 years prior. And to my people who think 15 years ago is a long time, here's a list of things that happened 15 years ago from the time I'm writing this in 2024, and see how many of these things we remember. Barack Obama was sworn in as president. Michael Jackson died. Glee. Captain Sully lands his plane on the Hudson. Kanye took the mic from Taylor Swift at the VMAs. Blue People Avatar. Jersey Shore. So yeah, I'm sure somebody made the connection. This was some low-key subversive material, and I'd like to advocate for Boris Aronson's idea of hell to be in the discussion of crazy set designs right next to all of the ramps in Starlight Express. Using this kind of shorthand and willingness to speak to the audience through his design not only worked for his personal style and artistic philosophy, but would also be one of the reasons why artists we'll talk about later respected his work so much, and why his work is still talked about alongside the shows he worked on. He had knowledge and experience in tradition, but found how to adapt in the face of changes coming. Tradition. For some reason, I feel like that's going to be important in the future. We fast forward to the 1950s. Think about what the stereotypical image of the US post-World War II is. I'm sure it's some kind of scenario of a father driving around his brand new $1,500 car and telling mother about how great their new $8,000 home is, while a child tells them both about how they practice ducking under their desk to be safe from the A-bomb. Generally, the world was, perhaps naively, optimistic about where things were and where they were heading. However, a strange phenomenon began to arise in the world of theater. Whereas the 1930s and 40s sought to help audiences escape the troubles of the Great Depression and the war, Broadway in the 1950s began to reckon with the fact that the world was only a superficial level away from its worst tendencies. You see this in a show like South Pacific, where people have to confront the racism that they might not have even known existed within them, or in Long Day's Journey into Night, tackling the idea that the family unit can be fallible and even toxic. It was in this era that Boris would see a resurgence of his career. While he was by no means unemployed in the 30s and 40s, commercial theater at the time really didn't fit what Boris was best at. I think that this idea of artistic selectiveness is something that we don't necessarily think too much about when it comes to people like set designers. Of course, Boris Aronson could put together a stage for a show like Annie Get Your Gun, but at the end of the day, when an artist really resonates with a piece, it shows. And for Boris, he thrived when a show was questioning the world around him and when he can represent the abstract. This is going to be at the core of the biggest works that he's going to take part in for the rest of his career. In 1953, Aronson would create the world of Salem, Massachusetts for Arthur Miller's The Crucible, a familiar friend, I'm sure, to many a former high schooler out there. Miller had already questioned the military-industrial complex in All of My Sons and wanted to hold a mirror to McCarthy's America through the fictionalization of the Salem witch trials, where the name of the game was to deflect attention from person to person. Boris was an artist who was uniquely situated to distill a work to a single idea, and then blow that idea into a fully fleshed out world. The Crucible has incredibly high stakes, and it can be very easy for an artist to be tempted to steer into that and create a larger-than-life work, but again, Boris understood restraint. For this episode, I had the honor of being able to look through Boris Aronson's papers and work through the Billy Rose Theater Division of the New York Public Library for the Performing Arts, which I will be referring to as the NYPL from here on out because that is a mouthful. I'll be referencing a lot of what I found, which includes photos from his sets for The Crucible. Looking at these images, I found myself impressed at how Boris understood that at its heart, the stakes of The Crucible come from its intimacy, and that there should be minimal space for distraction. The main structures of cabins and meeting halls generally didn't carry large decorations. This ensures that all of the focus remains on the performances of the actors and the words they say, and pushes the reality of the situation over the realism of the set. Aronson also worked on the set for William Inge's Bus Stop. For this show, Boris was able to create a lived-in diner where the entirety of the show takes place. In the case of Bus Stop, the characters remain snowed in a diner and are slowly forced to open up to various degrees. The singular set of the diner then becomes a pressure cooker where everyone has to face the idea of loneliness. Continuing the train of drama bangers that you read in school, Boris also was the mastermind behind the set for the original Broadway production of The Diary of Anne Frank. In my research for this episode, I found an interview he did with Anne Frank's director Garson Kanin, where he talked briefly about the process of creating the show. Kanin wanted to reinforce the theme of privacy in the show. He found that drafts up to that point ultimately weren't conveying what he felt was the worst part of the experience, which was the claustrophobia. So he scrapped the show as it existed with multiple rooms and asked for Boris Aronson to help him convey that idea. Boris took creative liberties in adapting the secret annex to fit the stage, but the name of the game was that it, like Bus Stop, was all one singular location to reinforce the claustrophobia, despite it being much larger than the real annex. If you were to look at pictures of the original set, the interior set lives in the realm of realism. Couches are couches, beds are beds, and the proportions are accurate and the lines are all straight. But as you move towards the exterior parts of the house and into the backdrop of the set, it moves into the realm of historical Yiddish theater. The slants of the roof are just slightly less than realistic, and the backdrop is a painting of the surrounding houses in the neighborhood. One can only imagine that Boris was trying to not only tell a Jewish story with the language of traditional theater, but perhaps hint that The Diary of Anne Frank was a new entry into the canon. Aronson would complete this run of instant classic dramas with his work on Arthur Miller's A View from the Bridge. During this time, Boris also began to make his presence known at the Tony Awards. Before I go into this, I have to say that at this time, a designer could only win one Tony for work across multiple productions in the same season. So if I were a set designer and I designed 3 shows in a season, I could only get 1 nomination for all of them, rather than 3 individual nominations. Boris won his first Tony in 1951 for his work on the plays The Country Girl, The Rose Tattoo, and Seasons in the Sun. While not winning again in the 1950s, he was nominated every year from 1956 to 1959 for his work on 10 other shows, which is crazy to think about. Because, yeah, you do see designers with multiple nominations now, but imagine if in the current arrangement of the Tonys, you had a designer not only nominated every year for 4 straight years, but sometimes getting 4 whole nominations in a single year for 4 straight years. I'm just saying. More love to designers. I think we can appreciate them more for what they do. Anyway, sorry about that. While the 1950s showed off that Boris Aronson was a force to be reckoned with, the 1960s saw him take his talents to musical theater and work alongside 2 of the biggest rising stars it had to offer. I've had many discussions about what exactly is the first concept musical, which, in case you don't know, just to be brief, is a show that isn't built around a story, but rather an idea or a theme that informs the show as a whole. So, for example, the musical Chicago, the driving idea of the show is society's fascination with fame and crime, and any story that comes as a result of that is in service of that theme. I want you to roll along with me for a while on 2 ideas, and once this episode's over, you can do as you please. Hold on to that idea, ignore me, totally up to you. First is that Kurt Weill and Alan J. Lerner wrote one of the earliest examples of a concept musical in their 1948 show, Love Life. Second is that the idea of the concept musical and its construction didn't reach its full maturity until the late 60s and the 70s. Okay? Stay with me. Let's move forward. So, we may be inclined to write off shows such as Love Life or Rodgers and Hammerstein's Allegro because they preceded the years where the concept musical reached its peak. I think that Love Life has a place in the conversation because it used a generally unstructured narrative to explore marriage over 150 years, which at the time was a highly abstract concept that the audiences were not ready for. But you know who was game to take on the task? The scenic designer of Love Life. Go ahead and guess who it is. I'll wait. It's Boris Aronson. That's right. From the time the concept musical was in its infancy, Boris Aronson was there to give place and time to theme. The transition to musicals from straight drama can seem pretty jarring until you remember that at his heart, Boris sees himself as a painter, an artist, interested in conveying the abstract. In his interview with Canon, he makes it clear that he holds disdain for an idea where media, theater, movies, and even television seem to be preoccupied with quote-unquote family drama. What he meant is that he believed that entertainment became too preoccupied with realism and lost a lot of capacity for storytelling by holding to that realism too strictly. As we know, Boris wants to express himself in anything besides realism, and what better place to avoid realism than the world of spontaneous song and dance? Boris was notorious for going against the mold of typical designers who would work on multiple projects in a single season. Comparatively, he was picky. He didn't want to limit himself to constructing living rooms for another play, and that shift is at the heart of his decision to move towards musicals. So we fast forward to 1964. Boris has just joined the team of a musical adaptation of the work of Sholem Aleichem. The show, which will become Fiddler on the Roof, has finally nailed down the idea at the heart of the show, a word that we encountered earlier: tradition. Once the theme of tradition entered the chat, the narrative, the conflict, everything about the structure of the show fell into place. In one of those perfect moments where all of the wavelengths meet, the theme resonated all the way down to Boris Aronson. When I say sometimes the right person in the right show creates magic, this is one of those times. Aronson understood the assignment. I don't think there's ever been one actor, director, designer, what have you, that has been more suited to a project than Boris Aronson was to Fiddler. And as you imagined, he handled it with the utmost care. He chose to let the stage speak to the tradition of Jewish theater makers that he came from and showcase how their style could elevate the show. In its staging, the hallmarks of traditional theater were present. Character was most important, so the sets were not elaborate. Realism was not meant to be the guiding principle. Rather, everything was done to resemble the work of painter Marc Chagall, who, if you remember, he quite literally had written the books on. Texture of the walls was intentionally painted to look like it came from one of Chagall's paintings, and that the whole show came out of a book. Whole rooms for sets were hardly more than their edifice. The lines were always a bit askew, and it all just works brilliantly. Boris looked to incorporate circles in his sets as a shorthand for tradition in the show, and found ways to make straight lines in distinct places to signify the breaking of the loop of that tradition. So, to use an example, Tevye's home is on a revolving piece which spun around at various points in the show to reinforce that circle, and by the end of the show, the revolving piece of the set no longer operates. The circle is broken, and the residents of Anatevka walk off the stage in a straight line. The song If I Were a Rich Man was set among a pump, a wall, and a small fence, and yet you never question that you're outside of a barn. And the backdrop paintings that go along with all of it are stunning. Boris was a master at looking at the future and knowing what parts of the tradition are still valuable. And if that isn't Fiddler, I don't know what is. Fiddler's producer, Hal Prince, was a man who had worn many hats in the theater, and he had his eyes set on directing. Inspired by his time in Germany while in the army, Prince set about moving the needle of the concept musical forward with his 1966 show, Cabaret. At this point, Boris is becoming the person that someone's referring to when they say, I know a guy. It's Boris. He's the guy. Hal Prince wanted to create a sense of unease with the show, to remind people of a harsh reality that wherever people may be, they have the capability to do bad things, and felt that the key to it was to involve the audience in some way. The first way was in Kander and Ebb's music. The songs of Cabaret don't really grow naturally out of the scenes the way audiences had seen since Oklahoma. Rather, the songs in Cabaret, many of them are pretty jarring. That's why a song like If You Could See Her comes like, bam, smash, in your face, right after the scene, and is sung by a character that wasn't in the previous scene at all. This is done so that the songs comment on the story. So imagine you're in the audience in 1968, and after watching a scene that you initially thought meant one thing, bang, here's a song for you to make you really think about what the scene is really about. So in a way, you're already questioning if this fun little show you thought you were watching is really beginning to take you for a loop. And by the time you catch on, it's too late to do anything but experience and think. Second was in Boris's design work. Prince would trust him with two main tasks. First would be to find a way to create a clear divide between the narrative of the book and the Kit Kat Club, where the songs would comment on that story. Second would be to find a way to reinforce that the audience was meant to be in active conversation with the musical from their seat. In a moment of inspiration, Aronson found the way to kill two birds with one stone. He used a material that was developed in the mid-50s called mylar, which is something like a foil that we usually use today in stuff like those metallic-looking birthday balloons, packaging, or the foil of a Pop-Tart. Also, to my photographers, it's also useful for creating an effective water effect in the studio because space-age problems require space-age solutions. He made a rain curtain out of that mylar for characters to walk through when they exited the real world of the book and into an abstract world of commentary in the Kit Kat Club. something shiny and special just to show a change, just as Hal Prince requested. Then, to address the other side and really get the audience uncomfortable, he used a bigger, more solid piece to create a curtain for the show. This curtain, rather than be shiny as the rain curtain was, acted on Mylar's other great quality. It can be made reflective. Hal Prince wanted the audience to ask themselves what they would do as the world around them turned for the worse. And what better way to do that by holding a giant mirror to their faces. The audience acted as unknowing participants in Cabaret. By seeing themselves in a mirror throughout the show, the audience would be faced with their reactions to the material. And at the end of the show, the curtain would return to face the audience as a way to represent how the audience was complicit in the events of the show. Side note, as someone who dreams of staging shows where people can see other people's reactions, and as someone who's genuinely terrified of Cabaret, you hit the head on the nail there, Boris. Boris wouldn't win the Tony for Fiddler, but he would for Cabaret, and again for his next collaboration with Hal Prince on Zorba, bringing his total wins to 3 and his nominations at 9. And as the 1970s approached, Prince would combine with Stephen Sondheim to bring the concept musical to its peak, and Boris would be there with them, creating what can only be described as a musical theater megazord. Hit it! Personal side note, I don't know what my favorite Sondheim show is. I couldn't tell you what song of his is my favorite. There's too many. But what I can tell you is that I love the opening number of Company. Stevie really wanted to flex right out of the gate. I especially love how the cast near the end of the song will hold their notes on the word love in the phrase, "We love you" for a full 20 seconds, or nearly 5 whole measures for my truly musically inclined friends, for one word. I used to think that it was just Stephen Sondheim showing off until I learned that it's Boris Aronson's fault. If you've seen Company, you know that the show exists in snapshot of the main character Bobby's life, where the timeline of the show is less important. So the set couldn't veer into a direction that became too realistic or took away from keeping an eye on the relationship characters have with each other. It's right up Boris's alley. Boris's backdrops originated from photos that were meant to evoke feelings of isolation and cold that the city brings. He created a bare bones structure with 2 levels that has platforms for individual scenes to take place on. It was intentionally designed to be pliable and not representative of a real place. Aronson has said that he wanted to give the cold impression he got from a hospital in the set, because that's what New York was to Boris. It's what he had come to learn. He was very aware, as was Sondheim, that it really is a city of strangers. He also incorporated an elevator on the set for the cast to get between levels. However, the elevator did present challenges in staging, as it did take somewhere around a full 20 seconds, or nearly 5 measures for my truly musically inclined friends, of music to operate. So Sondheim, needing to stall so that the cast members who needed to use the elevator near the end of the song could get to the first level with everyone to close it out, just extended the note on love and made the whole cast hold it until everyone was accounted for. So no matter what happens in the staging of the show, that is Boris Aronson's enduring legacy to Company. But the note might not have ever gotten to be held, though. Boris might not have ever gotten the chance to dive headfirst into his work with Prince and Sondheim, simply because he almost didn't work on the show at all. Here, my friends, is where we get to be glad about historical research methods, because there is no better place to find tea than in the archives. Because let's get one thing clear. People are going to be people. And people are messy, shady, and all around goofy. And however the history is written, sometimes the evidence of the drama makes it through. And that's what we're going to talk about in this little portion that I will now call Pocket Dramaturg Tea. In his later years, Hal Prince would not hesitate to praise Boris for his creative input and what he meant to each production. But in the moment, egos got in the way. Now, We returned to the materials I got from the NYPL, as any good researcher should. I wanted to get as many primary sources at my disposal. I initially requested everything I could on Boris, but noticed that the library had a folder dedicated to his correspondence with Hal Prince in its Hal Prince collection. So I figured, yeah, I should probably look at this. Maybe I'll get to see them figure out some design element that I had never heard of before. What's the worst that can happen? The folder seemed pretty standard at first glance. A lot of postcards that Hal sent from his various trips around the world. But then I read closer at a few documents. What I found was an argument on paper between Boris Aronson, Hal Prince, and Aronson's lawyer L. Arnold Weisberger. So the story starts in March of 1969. Playbill magazine includes in its March issue an interview between Hal Prince and Joan Alleman. The interview chronicled Prince's work in researching and preparing to put together the original Broadway production of Zorba. He gave all of the details from his quote-unquote diary, how the idea of Zorba was presented to him, how Kander and Ebb thought it would be a perfect idea, detailing his trip to Greece and to Crete for research, and finally, a little of the rehearsal process. And upon reading it, Aronson thought, he didn't mention me at all. So he wrote Hal about it. No, I don't have that letter, but I have Hal's reply. To which Hal essentially said, Boris, it's okay. Don't get mad. I mentioned everyone and Joan edited it how she wanted. Also, side note, he also asked Boris if he really thought he was the kind of guy who kept a diary, and if he did keep a diary, wouldn't it be more exciting than that? Hal, what are you doing, man? I gotta know now. So the issue was put to bed. For now. Fast forward to April of 1969, and Prince is already getting to work on what would become Company. And he wants Boris to design the show. So he has a contract sent over for Boris to sign, so he can get started. Boris asks his lawyer, L. Arnold Weisberger, to ask Prince for a copy of the script. He did this to get an idea of what he might be in for from a creative standpoint. Boris was also worrisome of signing on to a Hal Prince project blind, having felt that his work on Zorba was a lot harder than he initially signed on for. So he wanted to be sure that the contract would be fair with his experience and the work that he would have to do. A simple and fair request, of course. Not to Hal Prince, it wasn't. On April 28th, Weisberger wrote Boris in a fever, literally right after getting off the phone with Prince so that he could write about their conversation while it was still fresh in his mind. We've all done this. He told him that Hal was bloody disturbed by Boris's request to get the script for Company and only got more pissed from there. He said that the contract was absolutely non-negotiable and that Boris knew as much about Company as he did. Hal also said that nothing about his vision for Zorba changed throughout the process, essentially implying that if it had been difficult for Boris, it was his own fault, and that despite all of this great work that they had made together, maybe it was time for their working relationship to end. The conversational nature of this letter really makes me laugh, because there's a whole section where Weisberger essentially is writing like he has Boris in the room with him, talking like, I didn't even bring up your designs for Zorba again after that because I don't know enough about that to get into it with him any further. And also, if you're such great collaborators, why didn't he bring you up in the Playbill article? But I also thought it was not a good idea to bring up the Playbill article again because that definitely would have made things worse. So I didn't say that to him either. And also, he said you apologized for not thanking everyone in your Tony speech, which I don't think you needed to do in the first place. Crazy. So Boris gets this letter on the 28th, and on April 29th, he gets his own letter from Hal addressing the situation. To give Hal Prince his credit, this letter is a lot less angry than Weisberger would have you believe. Hal tells Boris that, yeah, he didn't like the call he got. Not so much that he wanted to read the script, but more that he didn't appreciate the implication that it was Hal's fault that Zorba was hard for Boris. So, Hal, in words that I thought were a little bit too big boss-like, explains that their work is hard, but if it's hard, that means you care. And if you care, you're willing to break your back a little. For Boris, that means being open to not knowing precisely what's needed from him and having to work on the fly. Hal says that everyone, him, Stephen Sondheim, and George Firth, are all going to be breaking their back over Company in some capacity, and that he wouldn't ask Boris to do it if he wasn't also willing to be hard on himself in the process as well. He just didn't like the assumption that he thinks his collaborators are his underlings. He also finished by saying that he reacted badly on the phone with Weisberger, but Boris should be glad because it simply means he cares. It appears this diplomatic approach of the director worked because Boris ultimately signed on to design company. But if the drama ended there, I would be moving on. But alas, I'm not moving on yet. Fast forward again a year, and Weisberger is again writing Boris with a copy of a letter he just wrote to Hal Prince, essentially questioning why Boris's name was left off an ad for company in that Sunday's issue of the New York Times. He casually reminded him of his contractual duties in crediting Boris, and casually reminded him that Boris is a big-name designer, and he would only help sell company, and casually implying that only insecure directors try to take all the credit, and I know you aren't one of those guys, right? Weisberger is clear to Boris that he really hopes that Hal doesn't take the message too badly, which, if I'm Boris, I gotta be like, you put the stick of dynamite in the oven. What do you mean you hope it doesn't explode? The story within the resources does, unfortunately, though, end there. I spent a lot of time on this, but plainly I do believe that Hal Prince knew the worth of Boris Aronson. In a letter to the drama desk, Hal called Boris an author as much as the director or a choreographer. He recognized his role as the director is to ask questions with the intention of building a show, and that the answers of someone like Boris helps create the show through their answers. Prince and Sondheim would continue to call on Aronson throughout the 1970s. After winning Tony No. 4 for Company, he created the Decrepit Theater that hosted the reunion of Characters and Follies, and won Tony No. 5. He created The Woods for a Little Night Music. Didn't win the Tony for that one, but got nomination number 12. Boris's final collaboration with Prince and Sondheim would be arguably one of their most ambitious, with Pacific Overtures, where Aronson joined Prince and Sondheim in trying to emulate the style of Japanese kabuki. The problematicness of the whole project is clear. The sets were big and beautiful. Chief among them is this really incredible ship that he built for the stage that almost seems to unwrap when its pieces move from behind each other. And that's just one piece that really sticks out. But when I tell you the entire show is just a piece of art form from start to finish, while I don't have time to really get into it in detail, I highly recommend watching the pro shot from its original Broadway run. While Pacific Overtures didn't get much love from audiences or awards, Boris Aronson received his final Tony nomination and win, finishing his career with 13 nominations and 6 wins. Pacific Overtures would be Boris Aronson's last original work for Broadway. He passed away at the age of 81 in 1980. Before he passed, however, he did do one final piece, a revival of Fiddler on the Roof. I think there's something beautiful in that. His final show being not only one of the ones that changed his career, but one that spoke to the legacy he left behind. A legacy of marrying tradition and creativity, and making the set, and I know this sounds cliche, as much of a character as any actor on stage. It's almost poetic that the man who bridged the gap between the old way of transporting an audience to the new way left before he could see Maria Bjornsson's Chandelier Fall in Phantom of the Opera, or David Corn's Nightclub in Here Lies Love, or Eugene Lee's Time Dragon in Wicked. Today, Boris's legacy remains. His son Mark, an author, is committed to documenting his father's work through lectures, oral history projects, and writing. But I think that even if we no longer use his blueprints or designs to create sets, what he created found a way to connect with theme that made the shows he worked on classics and thus made sure he would live on. That's why we will always talk about the paintings of Fiddler, and why even nearly 60 years later, revivals of Cabaret will reconstruct a theater's seating so that you too can be in conversation with the piece the way Boris wanted. I'll reference his interview with Cannon one more time. Cannon spoke to something Aronson had said, which is that if he were to be asked what he was most proud of, it wouldn't be any of the shows that he worked on. It would be the ones that he didn't say yes to. I think that's a really nuanced way of thinking for an artist. With all the opportunities he could ask for, he was most proud that he was able to maintain true to himself. We come to the theater to be transported, and Boris Aronson, as an artist and a collaborator, understood that at the end of the day, creating art was, and I paraphrase his words, about finding the artistry in the things not signed by Picasso. Thanks to Boris, the theater has been given a greater capacity to challenge what can be put on stage and communicated without words. Thanks to artists like Boris, we come to the theater over and over again and feel that unexplained pull towards the stage. That's the end of the episode. Thanks for listening to this episode of Pocket Dramaturg. This episode was hosted, written, edited, and produced by Ricky Ortega. Associate producer is Bridget Martinez. You can follow the show on Instagram at pocket_dramaturg and Twitter at Pocket Dramaturg, and subscribe on YouTube as well. Last, if you enjoyed this show, share it with someone you know. See y'all next time.